I wanted to jump on a call with you just to kind of speak more about mental health and your part that you've played in it up to this point and yeah, just ask you a little bit more about it. So I think that kind of leads me on to my first question of can you introduce yourself please and just tell us a little bit more about yourself?
Yeah, sure. So I'm David Saab. I am Business Alliance Manager at the Thames Valley Chamber of Commerce. Um, I, which is a glorified account manager, really. Um, I look after some of the senior businesses in the region in membership with the chamber. I also have led the work for the mental health work that we do with organisations, and um, I'm experienced from the point of view of I've suffered with poor mental health for a number of years, so I have a personal lived experience of of poor mental health as well. How's that for an intro?
No, it's good. It's not necessarily good in terms of the poor mental health part, but it gives a nice insight into where you're at. When you say poor mental health, what does that mean?
Uh, I suppose using words that possibly we banter around things like depression, anxiety, um, but we can also throw in despair, hopelessness. I find those words a little bit more helpful when I'm kind of trying to figure out my stuff.
That's interesting because it's like you said, those words are commonly thrown around, aren't they, in day to day language,
Mm.
whereas they're they're big feelings that people do experience. So when you say that in terms of your own journey and where you've got to now, what age would you say you first started feeling or having those thoughts?
Yeah, good question. So being this side of 40, shall we say, I've got the retrospective advantage of looking back to my younger years. And possibly when I was younger, I wouldn't have recognized it. And even more so because when I was younger, we didn't really talk about it anyway. We didn't talk about mental health, unless you were nuts, right? And I use that expression loosely, but that's the kind of expression, kind of term that we would use back then. So, but having the benefit of hindsight, I can certainly see patterns in my moods and in my um, should we say feelings of isolation, depression, uh, in my early 20s, and then I can also see signs as well going back to being a very young kid. But it's very difficult to kind of go back there and prescribe what exactly that was. um I know I felt different, isolated, and I think I was naturally an introvert and withdrawn and didn't really socialize very easily. It was an effort for me to socialize. So, was that mental health issues? Was it just my upbringing, my position in the family? Yeah, one can go down a rabbit hole on that, but I'll say certainly in my early 20s, I recognized the depression side of things.
That's interesting because I suppose there wasn't necessarily a catalyst that kick-started it. By what you're saying, it was more of a thing that you had felt within from a young age, and you think that may have come from being introverted and a little bit isolated. Is that what you're saying?
Yes and no. I mean, I could probably look at events in my early 20s that introduced trauma into the equation, and possibly trigger points for for big bouts of depression after that point. So I think, yeah, there was a hook as a young man growing up, but I think there are also circumstances and life choices in my 20s that certainly didn't help. So I I think it's a combination of both, really.
Mm, that makes sense. And how, as sort of two parts in the next question. One, how did you deal with it at the time? And the second part is how would you have dealt with it at the time in hindsight?
Um, at the time, I escaped in substances and kind of um, living on the edge, seeking thrills and pleasures and things which I knew were empty, but I don't think I had a very strong sense of self or kindness to myself in order to kind of go a different way. In even though I had a deep belief in God and things like that, um, I went on a fairly self-destructive path for a while. Yeah.
Mm. And in hindsight, now knowing what you do and having lived through that and experienced that, how would you have dealt with it when those first waves and feelings and thoughts of, despair and hopelessness manifested themselves?
Um, I mean, one would like to give the right answer, and say, well, I would do this differently, and I'd spend lots of time meditating and thinking about things and praying, and I wouldn't chase substances and women, and I would kind of align myself to my faith and what I know to be good. But hey, when you're young, well, not necessarily just when you're young either. I think throughout life, you
Mm,
do what you do, and you can only reflect on it. So I'm going to resist going back and saying what I would do differently
yeah.
because you know, yeah, no point.
Mm, that's interesting because I suppose it is. There's no benefit to thinking that. I suppose there's no upside to it. It's in the past, right?
I mean, what's more useful for me is to try and understand myself, right? I mean, it's a lifelong journey, I'm sure, because I'm still doing it. I only know the life I've lived, but to understand, why do I feel those feelings? Where do they come from? You know, we often hear about early childhood triggers that when you react emotionally to certain things, it's often down to something in childhood where you felt a similar anxiety or fear or something upsetting, and it can trigger those feelings later on. So I'm all about, I suppose, sitting with myself and just understanding. Okay, so you feel this way. What could that be? And trying to stay with it rather than um, escape from it. Yeah, and that's a balance too because I spend most of my routine, you know, morning gym session doing it, and that's all about kind of forcing myself to feel and think a certain way. So I do spend much of my time escaping, trying to kind of force myself to feel a certain way, but I also reserve a lot of time for just reflecting on why do I feel this way? Where does this come from? What does this mean?
Mm. So I suppose the way that you kind of moved away from that and have grown into where you're at now, obviously, family, kids, partner, work, it's obviously different to, like you said, when you were early 20s. And I think based off what you said there, it's a balance of the two things of sitting in it, living in it, but also finding a positive outlet to take your mind away from it, which is of course it's going to be important, right? But if you're only ever away from it and you're always constantly chasing those feelings of escapism, then I suppose it's going to be tough to challenge those thoughts and feelings.
Yeah. The most difficult part is actually sitting with the uncomfortable feelings because it's human nature. You know, you don't want to feel lonely or depressed or despair or help, hopelessness. They're uncomfortable feelings. Um, but because of the experiences that I've had, I know that it's important to stay with that. Um, yeah.
Hmm. It is really interesting. I mean, obviously the thing that sparked this conversation, I mean, we've been in contact for a good few years now, but the thing that sparked this conversation is the fact I'm doing my run for Mind, and opening up these conversations. And I just think the reason it's so interesting is because everyone's story and journey is so different, and everyone's response to it is different as well. The one thing that I see a lot of now in the space I'm in and the industry I'm in is young people, really young people, struggling and suffering with mental health. I think a new there's like a whole new strand and wave that comes in through social media and the comparison and constantly lining yourself up against this person and this person and this person.
Mm.
What are your thoughts on that? What are your thoughts on social media?
I mean, I got three boys, about your age, Taryn. So, and you know, my youngest struggles particularly. He's got ADHD. He's got mental health issues, and social media is absolutely massive. I mean, if I'm honest, social media impacts me, right? And I'm supposedly, not of that generation, but you know, goodness knows the impact that it has on young people. But what I do see is the comparisons. Um, for my lads, what does it mean to be a man, right? Um, and the impact of just image and image. I mean, when I was younger, a young man, pornography was, a magazine in someone's duffel bag, during lunchtime, and it was like, oh wow, look what it's kind of, or on the top shelf. Whereas now it's just proliferate, right? And if a young man has a propensity to kind of look at that, go down that rabbit hole, then the algorithm is just gonna destroy them, right? And
Yeah.
I think that's really harmful because not to be too poetic, but the beauty of human relationships and the intimacy of human relationships, and the intimacy that we have with ourselves in relationship with ourselves, all of that seems to be vacuumed up by social media and just spat out, you know. And I just think it's so destructive, and I don't think it's um, by chance that we have young people with suicidal thoughts, self harming, um, you know, anxiety, depression. I think definitely all exacerbated by social media. I'm not going to say caused by, right, but I certainly think that that social media is the worst um, aspect of our humanity, which is vanity, pride, jealousy. It's all it tends um, to portray us as um, less than human. You know.
Mm. That is interesting, and that word is interesting as well. Of portrayal, because that is what social media is, right? It's putting across an image of yourself that people can consume. I mean, we had someone in last week. We were kind of having a similar conversation, and that's it. That was a young music artist, and and they were comparing themselves to this other artist who was similar age, maybe a little bit younger than them, and they were saying, oh, look at, he just posted his apartment, and he just posted his car and his watch, and I was just saying to him, the reality is you have no idea if they've rented the apartment for half a day and filming some content in it. You have no idea about whose car it is. You have no idea whose watch it is. We don't know. It's just a portrayal of what that person has decided they want us to see. And that's where social media is so dangerous. And there's a lot of positive stuff on there, a lot of self-help and good quality podcasts and people having real conversation. There is, for sure, but that's not the stuff that goes mega viral, is it? By the
No.
nature of the terminology, viral, it's like kind of shocking, right? It's like, wow, this is something we've never seen before, and that's what that's what lets it down. And that comparison is, it's like a thing that you can't help but do it. I think we all do it on social media, especially when you're kind of coming out of school or university, and it's like, okay, this
Mm,
person's my age and they're doing this.
mm,
I don't think that ever, doesn't even have a beginning point now, because kids are on social media from 10, 11 years old. They might compare themselves to their friend who's gone to holiday in a, been on holiday in a really nice spot. And the fact that that's
yeah.
being rooted now from 8, 9, 10 is scary, because even my generation, that was not a thing. We had Blackberries, we were on Blackberry Messenger till about 14. And then you've got Instagram, but Instagram was innocent. It was
Mm,
friends posting photos of their food and silly selfies. But now it's, yeah, the
yeah.
algorithm and what it decides to push is pretty scary.
Yeah. Yeah. I agree. I mean, you know, with this, um, with your sport escapade that you're about to undergo,
Yeah.
I mean, what are your hopes? What would you like to see different for our young people? I mean, what do you know what you want?
Yeah, I do. I think that, because for me, I struggled a lot in COVID, because
Mhm.
it just threw my whole psyche out the window. Everything that I had going on stopped.
Mhm.
So I just felt unlike myself, really. And because COVID was it was very intense for a very long period of time, it was tricky to kind of pull myself back out of it.
Mhm.
And the thing that really, really, really helped me was actually seeing, for in my case, it was seeing other guys speaking about it openly, because that just isn't it's not an open gateway into a lot of conversations. If you go out with your friends, or you're having you know, a chill one with a few of your guy mates, it's just not something you would ever speak about. And that's still very much the case. But I think the more content that can be consumed that is positively reinforcing that these are real thoughts, they are real feelings, people do experience this every day, it is like a little kind of tap on the shoulder of, like, you're not the only person in the world that thinks this way or feels this way. And I genuinely do believe that. Um, just someone seeing that piece of content can be, it can change a lot.
Mhm. So when you were in COVID and you were struggling
Mm.
and you came across other other blokes who were saying how difficult it was for them, what did that do for you?
I think it was just very eye opening, because COVID, obviously there was no contact, and I think COVID is actually very synonymous now with the social media wave, and people and kids being stuck inside on their phones. It's very, very similar. COVID was like that for me, what was like that for everyone. And nowadays, kids are inside on social media. It's the exact same, and what that does to your brain is it is scary because it just takes you out of that camaraderie and that feeling of community and spirit, and sharing those things with other human beings because that is what that's what we need.
Mm.
Whether you're introverted or extroverted, everyone's different. Everyone's personality is different, but we still need that human connection. We need that. And I think to answer your question, what that content gave me was that human connection without actually being there. I felt as if I was there,
Mm.
which helped. I don't know, it sounds a little bit maybe it sounds a little bit far fetched, but it was just something that it was very effective for me and just things in which they were saying. Some of the stuff I was like, actually, no, I'm not going to try that. But some of the stuff was like, okay, I could try that. And then you try it
Mm.
and it's great and it feels great. And it's like, okay, cool.
Mm.
That's just something that helped me, even with getting into the gym.
Mm.
And that's where it kind of comes full circle in terms of the running. That's when I started running. That's when I started focusing on gym in a serious way, strength and conditioning, and focusing on that part of myself to get my mind right because it's that balance, I suppose, of sitting in it, living in it, but also having that external thing where you can de-stress,
Mm.
declutter, I suppose.
Mm. Can I ask you,
Hmm.
this might be too personal, but when you were going through it with your, um, let's call it poor mental health,
Hmm.
can you recall a time when you actually shared how you were feeling with another person who wasn't in your family and what that was like?
Um, I think, I think for me, I don't recall ever speaking to someone external about it. I didn't really speak to anyone internal about it. It wasn't
Mm.
something I was comfortable with doing
Mm.
because it was that was a real at the time that was a real sign of, oh, this is different, this is a little bit weird, and it's not anything to do with my family or my friends or anything like that. It's just one of those things, isn't it, where it's just a bit awkward. How would you bring it up? How would you mention it? Um,
Mm.
and I think that was the real difficulty. But I think just creating content and having conversations that are available for people to see like this, I think opens up those conversations where if someone wanted to speak to me about something, they kind of feel as if they already know me to an extent because they've seen me speak about it or they've seen me speak with you about it. So it's like, I kind of feel like I'm there, sort of.
So, so
Intimate.
would you share your um, your experience of poor mental health now? If you were struggling,
Mm.
would you speak to anyone, or would you handle it the same way? It's just too awkward. It's no, it's really and then what would you do now?
You mean if I experienced it now or if I experienced it during
Yeah,
running?
if you experienced it now and you were feeling, let's say, depression,
Mm.
would you share that with anyone, or would you hide it?
I would share it now because I think there's just real strength and power in communicating that because otherwise it's like a self-deprecating thought, isn't it? You're just sitting there living with it by yourself every second of every day, which I don't think is conducive to growth or helping yourself. So yeah, I definitely would. Um, I'm not sure what that would look like, but it would be organic conversations, I think, with people that I, since then built that relationship more with. Because now, obviously, I'm speaking about it, so people know that it's something I've experienced before, and that's not something that that's not for me a thing that I'm trying to shy away from. Obviously, I've got stuff that I'm trying to build. I've got people that I work with. It's not something that I'm like, oh, I don't want to say that because this person might not work with me. You know, I don't really. It's not something that concerns me. If anything, it's okay, cool. If you don't want to work with me for that reason, then that's then that's absolutely fine. But if it attracts more people who are being authentic and being real, then that's great.
Yeah, interesting. Interesting.
It's just weird. It's just a weird thing, and I don't know if it will ever become a less taboo subject. I don't think it will. I mean, I think the difference now socially to when I experienced it at the time is that you see it written down more. Like you see more posts on LinkedIn about it, which is still effective, but you still don't really see that many people talking about it. I don't think you don't see that many people talking about it. People that I know who have experienced, you know,
Mhm.
similar things, if not worse, which is fine. Everyone's different. Everyone's different, but it's just still is very much a taboo thing and an awkward thing to talk about.
Yeah, and there's a huge difference when you, and I say from experience, when I share uh, my poor mental health with someone who understands what I'm going through, that's a massive impact on me, massive impact to when I start to share, because sometimes you test the waters with people, don't you? You wonder. I wonder how comfortable they would be if I share. So I perhaps might start to share something, and then I look for their reaction. And there's a mixed reaction. There's the glaze over. There's the suddenly they're a bit uncomfortable, and so you pull back. And it is rare that I get enough positive cues to actually say my experience of poor mental health, and it's a real, when I do share, it stays with me because then I feel that I'm connected to that person. That person has kind of um, seen inside me, and there's something about trust, and there's something about intimacy. There's something about being able to share with someone that experience, and that's rare. Um, and yeah, if we had more time, we could talk about workplace mental health and um,
Hmm.
how workplaces are um, dealing with it, and some of the tick box exercises that perhaps organisations are doing, when in reality the people who struggle, the ones who are on the edge, the ones who are really going through it, possibly what they need the most is to be able to speak with someone who can understand, who really can listen. And I recognize that that doesn't happen naturally in the workplace. That might be something for proper psychotherapy or proper counseling.
Hmm.
Um, yeah.
Yeah, it is really tough. It's a really yeah, because I suppose there's so many barriers and levels to it of if we don't really know what people are thinking or feeling. So I suppose even in a workplace, you'd have no idea who actually needed that support, who needed that help.
Mm.
You know, so it's I guess it'd be tough to even visualize pathways, I suppose, in ways in which you can help them.
Yeah, and I've often spoken to organisations about, hey, if you had an on-site psychotherapist, right,
Mm,
that saw all of your people, regularly once a month, they go in and perhaps there's stuff to share, perhaps there isn't. Um, an awful lot of stuff would come out in that process. And how do you cover the cost of that? How do you reduce the stigma of that? Well, looking at this absenteeism and presenteeism
mm,
that's happening in our workplace, there is an argument that actually um, it would support itself. If you're over sort of 50 employees, having an on-call psychotherapist rock up at your workplace to be able to see your employees could actually pay for itself. But the huge stigma and the huge misunderstanding about what is therapy, and a huge impact of NHS talking therapies, which is mostly cognitive behavioral therapy, which is kind of, hey, let's fix the problem. Try this exercise, try this. Whereas a lot of prevention, if you're talking about early childhood trauma, which is kind of revisiting someone, or grief, relationship breakdown, you need a therapist. You need a therapist who can go on a journey with you, who can just sit with you and trust you to bring what you need to bring in that session. And it isn't for the therapist to fix it. It's for them to witness you and to offer back to you what you're presenting. And in that process of really deep listening, awareness happens and things shift. But most people don't have an experience of proper therapy to know what that looks like. All they imagine is that the therapist is kind of talking at me, trying to tell me how to fix my problems. But if you look at proper psychotherapy, it's not anything like that.
It's interesting going back to when you were talking about the workplace specifically, is I'm just thinking as you were talking, there must even be an optics issue with that, because say if you have an in-house psychotherapist that, and it's not right, but I'm just thinking, is that a potential stumbling block where employees would be resistant to actually undertaking that sort of help, in the worry that will get back to their team, and then their team is going to judge them and see them differently, or not as strong, or they may not get that promotion because of they've been into the psychotherapist 3 times this month. So is that, do you know what I mean? It's like,
Yeah,
even that is
yeah,
an optics issue.
yeah. No, and you're raising really, really valid points, right? I mean, what do? Okay, let's get everyone to sit with a psychotherapist, right? So it isn't, just this person and this person. And I think that until the stigma is reduced, you're always going to get these barriers. What will this person think of me? I'm the same in my work. I mean, do I talk about my mental health with my bosses? No, there's no way, right? I don't want them to look on me as being incapable, or a bit loose, or not quite reliable, or not quite on his game. I don't want them. My fear is just like everyone else's. What will they think of me, and what will the repercussions be? We don't trust, right? And that comes down to a trust issue. But there are organisations where people do trust their management, and they can have these kind of conversations. And that's the culture that every leader surely would love to have, where you bring your whole self to work, where you can share really what's going on. I've seen some organizations who, there's this one organization, I won't say who, but his the main CEO's daughter had mental health issues, tried to end her life by, and he completely changed his stance. And from a top-down leadership position, he kind of instilled in his middle management, his senior management team, this acceptance of poor mental health as being something that you can support, you can help with. And he changed the way that the whole organization looked on poor mental health, and they pulled in support, and they kind of changed the whole messaging around it, and it really had an impact. But these great leaders who aren't afraid, who aren't afraid to admit their own sort of mental health issues, they are far and few between. It's still, the boardroom rules, You know, what's the return on investment? Performance, and we don't really culturally like to look at mental health. We don't like to look at poor physical health. You know, it it's just how it is, but it doesn't mean that we need to accept it in our own sphere of influence. We can change things.
Yeah, no, we definitely can, and I think we're all just trying to do what we can to help, reduce the stigma, and I think that that's all we can do really. So
Mm.
thank you, David. I appreciate you jumping on this call with me. I think we'll definitely be speaking more about it as the journey is always changing and growing and evolving and sometimes going backwards and moving sideways, and that's just how life goes, right? And I
Yeah.
think I think that's the beauty of having these conversations, and I'm sure we'll be having a lot more. So thank you for jumping on the call with me, man. I really appreciate it.